Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. We're thrilled. We have so many people here this afternoon to join us for this talk with Hope Kingsley. Dr. Kingsley is going to be talking, obviously, about the exhibition upstairs, the marvelous exhibition, Salt and Silver, Early Photography, 1840 to 1860. Hope and I have been working together on this show for quite a long time, and it's been, oh my God, I should step away from the computer, sorry. Wow. Sorry, Hope. I just kind of, yeah, exactly, sorry. Yeah, take control.
Yeah, that's how
Okay,
I like
good.
it.
All right. So, anyway, on that note.
Do you want to go back over
Yeah,
there?
yeah, I do. So I wanted to thank the sponsors of this exhibition who made this possible, and the generosity that they showed toward the project was quite extraordinary. The Eric Skipsey Fund at the SBMA, Jill and John C. Bishop Jr., Francis Kent, the Lorna Hedges Lecture Fund, Photo Futures, Lorna Hedges, Bob Bogosian and Beth Gates Warren, Priscilla and Jason Gaines, and Susan and Bruce Worster. Thank you. I also want to thank my colleagues here at the SBMA for this incredible installation that you see upstairs, and Larry Feinberg, of course, who greenlighted the project here based on his enthusiasm and his belief has been fantastic to have the support. The crews working were Phil Lord, Andrea Martinez, Kelsey McGinnis, Chris Park, Iggy Salcedo, and Paul Swenson. And I think both Hope and I think that it was an extraordinary privilege to work with these incredibly talented, imaginative, hardworking people. Also a debt to Fabian Leva Barragan, who just started about a month ago, and this was his project to take on. He did an amazing job that way. The exhibition is organized by the Wilson Center for Photography London with the Yale Center for British Art in New Haven, Connecticut. A version of the exhibition was on view at Tate Britain in 2015, before a larger version went to the Yale Center for British Art and then at the Ruth Chandler Williamson Gallery at Scripps College, Claremont. And before I had asked to take the show, Bob Turbin and Carol Vernon and I were talking about it and going out to see the show, and this began this process in my head about asking if we could have the exhibition here at the SBMA, and the Wilson Center was extraordinary in their energy and enthusiasm to have the exhibition here in Santa Barbara before it goes back to London. And Michael Wilson himself sent me a great email saying we are thrilled that it's going to be at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. He's been such a great supporter of ours, and this to me is quite a privilege to have it here just based on the relationship with Michael and this institution. The other thing I wanted to say is really the reason that all of us are here in a way, and I hope he's not embarrassed by this, but Weston Neff is in the audience, and Weston was the head of the Department of Photographs at the Getty, and he hired me, for some reason, to be the graduate intern in the Department of Photographs at the Getty, where I worked on Auguste Saltzman and other amazing activities. And so it gave me this grounding in the history of photography, even though I've spent most of my career in the modern and contemporary end. It gave me the background where I felt I really wanted to have this exhibition here so I myself could immerse myself in the earliest examples of photography. So Weston, thank you very much for having hired me. So Salt and Silver was curated by Dr. Hope Kingsley, who is the curator for education and collections at the Wilson Center for Photography. She's been a terrific colleague, as I mentioned, in this entire endeavor. She's a source of incredible knowledge, as we will hear, but she's also an incredibly imaginative, energetic person to work with on such a project that we have upstairs. She's one of the world's foremost experts on the early decades of photography, but she has not limited herself just to that area. In fact, she earned her undergraduate degree at UC Santa Cruz and her PhD at the Courtauld Institute. And she's the author of numerous catalogs and articles, and in recent years, including Painting with Light, Art and Photography from the Pre-Raphaelites to the Modern Age for Tate Britain, and Seduced by Art, Photography Past and Present with the National Gallery London, that traveled to the Caixa Forum in both Barcelona and Madrid. Please welcome my colleague and friend, Dr. Hope Kingsley.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for a wonderful collaboration on this exhibition. It's been a pleasure, a privilege. It's been incredibly stimulating intellectually, and it's been lots of fun. So I enjoyed every minute of it. And thank you to Larry Feinberg and all the team at this museum. It's just been a marvelous experience to see this project come together in this place. It looks marvelous, and I know that Wilson Center, even from afar in absentia, will really be appreciative of everything that's happened here. I also want to express my gratitude to Wilson Center, my colleagues Stephanie Smith in Los Angeles, who's here, and Polly Fleury and Ella Neff in London. And I want to connect the dots by saying that Weston Neff has been instrumental in so many things for Wilson Center, including Ella, and also was very important in terms of Michael Wilson collecting photography. And so we have a debt of gratitude to you. And of course, always gratitude to Jane and Michael Wilson. Their support for this project, as so much else, has been steadfast and constant. So, over many years, Wilson Center for Photography has collected photographs whose pictorial and material qualities show us historical photography in its best light. We've looked for beautiful examples of old photographs to show us, beyond connoisseurship, how these works looked in their own time, to give us access back 150, 170 years ago to see how the people who created these photographs saw their works, and indeed how their audiences saw them at that time. These early photographs are the beginnings of photography's history. They're all about photography on paper. I will explain briefly what the alternative was. But they're made within the first 25 years of photography's history. They're not well known today, largely, except for many people in this audience, but you don't represent a wider cohort, shall we say. But because they're rare, both in terms of the numbers of prints and the numbers of practicing photographers. This was such early days. But we've collected for this exhibition works by more than 30 photographers. So this really does represent a very good overview of what was happening in the first 2 decades of photography. And it also follows the spread of photography from Britain, from England, to Europe, to Russia, across the Mediterranean, to North Africa, to the Middle East, to India, China, Mexico, and the United States. But the exhibition, we've moved where we are. The exhibition starts with works by the British inventor of paper photography, William Henry Fox Talbot. Photography, for him, when he announced it for his audience in 1839, was a brand new territory of image making. And indeed, that newness and that novelty would continue. I heard something interesting, but it certainly wasn't expected. And the exhibition shows Talbot exploring various possibilities in terms of the medium and what it could do. This is Trafalgar Square in London. This is modern London. In fact, it's under construction. Nelson's column is under construction. So we're looking at very much the present day. And this is one of the very earliest portrait photographs on paper. This is an experiment by Talbot. He's trying to figure out portrait photography. So what does he do? He sits his oldest daughter down in the sunlight to pose for her picture. He's got a captive sitter, if you will. And this is taken at their home, the family home at Lacock Abbey. So he's put Ella in the sunlight. It's got to be bright sunlight to get a reasonably short exposure time. And he's settled her with her pose as relaxed as possible to hold still. She can't look into the sunlight because it's too bright, so she's turned her eyes off to the side, which gives the portrait a kind of inward contemplative air. The print itself has a softness and a delicacy that arises in part from the technology, because with Talbot's first process, the salted paper print process, the chemicals are applied as solutions and they're absorbed into the upper layers of the paper. So the image is not sitting on a coating as with the slightly later albumin print process or the more modern gelatin silver print process, but it's sitting within the paper. So it's an integral part of the paper, and the paper fibers subtly break up the outlines of the image. This is very different from the competing technology announced at the same time in 1839, the French technology of the daguerreotype, announced on behalf of Louis Daguerre, who took credit for this process. As many of you know, that's a contentious credit. But anyway, the daguerreotype, as you see here on your right, is an image exposed on a photosensitized silver plate. The image resolution is extremely good, and they're very beautiful objects, but they have a cold gray image color, which many at the time in the 1840s and 50s found unsympathetic. And indeed, in spite of Talbot's process having a less precise image resolution, many people preferred paper photographs. They indeed compared paper photographs with prints and drawings. And it was common in those early days to describe photographs on paper as sketches or drawings. Indeed, Talbot called his first photographs photogenic drawings. So there's a sense in which this new technology is being situated within existing technologies, if you will, existing graphic arts. This represents Talbot's scientific and scholarly interests. This is actually what we might call the first photocopy, the first Xerox, maybe you call it here. It's a tremendous practical breakthrough to be able to reproduce a printed page exactly. And this was something that Talbot's colleagues and peers found more exciting than any of his beautiful pictorial compositions. This was something that was really useful. And Talbot was certainly very keen to make the point of the utility of his invention. This is also a wonderful object because it's untrimmed, and it shows us how Talbot applied the light-sensitive chemicals to the paper. We see the brush marks. We know photography today as an industrial manufactured technology, and indeed it's been so for more than a century. But in these early years, photographs were handmade. And today we love to see these marks of the making. They bring us closer to the people who were making these photographs. They bring us closer to Talbot. They give us access to how he made his process work. So to explain it, salted paper prints are very simple technology. You soak your paper, good quality paper, writing paper perhaps, in a bath of table salt in solution, and you dry it, and then you brush over the surface with a silver compound, silver nitrate. The silver nitrate and the sodium chloride combine and produce a fairly efficient photosensitive compound. And that salt and silver explains where we got the title of the exhibition. Well, Talbot adapted the salted paper process to produce a more light-sensitive paper that could be more efficiently exposed in a camera. Salted paper is too slow, too insensitive to really get a camera exposure except over a very long period of time. So Talbot adapted the technology. He added more silver nitrate, he added gallic acid. He made this a more responsive, photosensitive process. And what we see here in a wax paper negative is a negative image, because this is how the chemistry works. Light makes the photosensitive silver go dark. So everything that's in a scene that's bright white is going to be dark on the negative. And then you print it on a sheet, another sheet of sensitized paper to get a positive image. So one negative can be used to make many positive prints, and it makes photography a reproductive medium. Indeed, as long as the negative holds up, it's a medium of mass reproduction. So whereas the daguerreotype was a unique object, one exposure gave you one polished silver plate with an image on it, and it could only be reproduced as a very poor quality etched intaglio plate, Talbot's process was a proper process of practical reproduction. Well, this is a wonderful image. It's a tableau set up at Talbot's home at Lacock Abbey, and it's thought to have been a collaboration between Talbot, his Dutch assistant Nicholas Henneman, and his great friend, the Welsh artist and photographer Calvert Jones. You know, photographers in these early years are connected by proximity. This is before photographic associations and photographic journals. We're in the early to mid 1840s. So Talbot's network, his friends, his colleagues, his peers, are how photography is initially disseminated and how it percolates outwards. One of those associates was John Gutch, who was based in South Wales, very close to Calvert Jones, and knew other people in Talbot's circle. And he was in touch with Talbot as early as 1841 by letter, and Talbot sent him specimens of sensitized paper, iodized paper that could then be fully sensitized. Gutch then went into diplomatic service and was out of photography for about 10 years. He returned to it when he was forced to retire because of a paralytic illness. And he took up photography as a way of a kind of therapy to get him out in the world and to mitigate the paralysis. This image and this one are from a wonderful scrapbook album that Gutch produced in about 1858 that tracked his expeditions through southwest England down to Cornwall. The album is a wonderful compendium of time and place because the range of subject matter is so great and delightful. And indeed, the exhibition includes not only pages from this partially disbound album, but an iPad that you can scroll through and see every page in the album. You know, the photography, yes, a reproductive medium, but this exhibition does include a number of unique objects, and it's really marvelous for us to get the sense of these quite precious objects on display upstairs here at Santa Barbara. Gutch's last project was a really ambitious one on the churches of England, and this is an image of Tintern Abbey, which was a famous site. It was celebrated by William Wordsworth in a famous poem, lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, and by the artist and writer William Gilpin, also working in the late 18th century, developing a whole aesthetic argument for the picturesque, which depends on nature as rather rough and untamed and natural. And indeed, this representation by Gutch very much tallies with that, with the ruined abbey and nature growing inwards into the ruin. And Gutsch himself did write about the picturesque in photography, so he made this connection quite specifically. Gutsch planned to photograph more than 500 churches, but his illness returned and he died before he was able to complete the project. Well, Talbot's network also extended to Scotland, where his work was disseminated by scientist friends like David Brewster at St. Andrews University. Brewster taught a young colleague at the university, John Adamson, who taught his brother, Robert Adamson. And then Brewster introduced Robert Adamson to a painter friend in Edinburgh, David Octavius Hill. And together they collaborated on a wonderful range of photographs, more than 3,000 in all, in a very short time, just about 4 years. The works range from portraits of Hill and Adamson's bourgeois world in Edinburgh to a wonderful series on fishing communities near Edinburgh. This is a very interesting street scene. We could say it's the first example of street photography that really it involves this whole range of individuals, more than 30 people in all. And it looks candid until we start seeing the comparison between the published version and the unpublished version. And we realize that this was set up. And indeed, we know from looking at how the shadow has moved for the woman standing at the center, about how long between these two exposures. So we know that it's about at least a half an hour between the two. And when you think of everybody holding still for the exposure time, which would have been, depending on the amount of light, it would have been maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. It's actually quite a long time. It's especially a long time if you're the woman in the middle with a basket in one arm and a child in the other. And so we kind of understand how carefully composed this is. Equally, this is carefully composed. They've worked out the placement of the figures so that you get this wonderful range, light, dark, laterally across the frame. It's a picture and it's a social document because this is showing the progressive world of the New Haven fishing community. It was a community that encouraged numeracy and literacy in women as well as men. And here, Mrs. Lyle, there on your left, is reading a letter. And lest you miss it, some of her fisherwomen are looking at her, so you really get a sense that this is the point of the picture. So it's an intentional cue, and it's about a community that was seen by Hill and Adamson's circle of progressive clergymen and social reformers as a model community with tremendous social cohesion and economic self-determination. Indeed, some of that comes forward in this portrait of fishermen from New Haven. And by the way, we know who all these people are. They're not social types, they're individuals. So Mrs. Ramsey in the previous picture, her husband, William Ramsey, is there on the right. And this is very much about men who are confident and in their element. They were tough men. They had a very dangerous profession, fishing for herring in the open seas. It was profitable, but it was perilous. And so they're tough. And they're wonderfully presented. There's the blur gives a sense of mobility and immediacy. It's as if this is a snapshot, but of course, it's not a snapshot. It was posed, it was constructed. But isn't it wonderful at this early time that you can have images that, yes, you know intellectually that it's a constructed image, but it still has that sense of immediacy and presence. It doesn't seem staid or staged. 10 years later, in the 1850s, the photographic arena is expanding. There are more photographers, and they have more professional aims and objectives. In 1855, the London photographer Roger Fenton went to the Crimea to photograph the British military campaign there. He was commissioned by the big London and Manchester publishers and print dealers, Thomas Agnew and Sons, because the Crimean War was in the news, partly because the British forces were being criticized for incompetence. This follows the devastating losses in the charge of the Light Brigade in 1854. So Agnew's wanted a positive take on the war, and they also wanted images that they could publish. The firm paid for 36 crates of supplies and equipment to go with Fenton and two assistants to this port at Balaclava. It was chaotic and dirty, but it was the staging place for the campaign. Now, Fenton's photographs show us the Crimean environment, but not the battlefields, which would have been a dangerous and logistical impossibility. You know, Fenton took a converted wine van with him that he used as a mobile darkroom, because in order to prepare his negatives, which by this time were made on glass instead of paper, that whole process for each exposure took 20 minutes. You had to prepare the plate, sensitize it, get it in a plate holder into the camera, make your exposure, and then back to the wine van very quickly to process it, all before the collodion dried. So it had to all be done on the spot. You can't do that in the middle of a battle. So what Fenton did was concentrate on camp life, which was marvelously interesting. It was a really eclectic range of allies who were fighting the Russians in the Crimea. So the British have the Scots and the Welsh, the French have North African soldiers, and the Ottomans use Balkan troops. And these are Croat chiefs, and all of them fighting the Russians. So Fenton's photograph was reproduced as a wood engraving in the Illustrated London News. That paper particularly saw readership increase dramatically during the war, and artists were sent to the front to generate images for the news. Although this particular representation happened when Agnew's was trying to promote an exhibition that they were staging of Fenton's work from the Crimea. You can see the extent to which such reproductions were part and parcel of life at the time, not just back in Britain, but in the Crimea. This hut is papered with illustrations from the Illustrated London News. Actually, the figure on the right is thought to be the painter himself, who was on the British military staff at that time. Well, Fenton's brief from Agnew's was to focus on the officers, but these are not the heroic swagger portraits that are seen in paintings. This is Viscount Balboni, and he was a young officer. If you look closely at his face in the exhibition, you might find it hard to believe he's only 24 years old here. He's got a really haggard face. He looks so much older, and his haunted stare has been described as showing shell shock. Indeed, he died 2 years later, reportedly worn out by the hardships and privations of the war. It's a tough image, but it was published. It was published in London and Paris, and indeed in the United States by the New York firm of Williams. Just to give you a comparison, this is a more typical representation of officers. So you can see that it's a very different approach that Fenton is taking, but his rough realism was deliberate. Indeed, he criticized artists' impressions of the Crimea, complaining that those sketches seemed to astonish everyone from their total want of likeness to the reality. Well, Fenton was alert to such artistic euphemisms because he was trained. He had trained as an artist, a painter in London and in Paris, where in the early 1840s he studied painting alongside other young painters who would become photographers and would become his photographic peers. His great contact was with Gustave Le Gray, who set up the first photography school in Paris in 1849. And this is a place where Le Gray trained about 60 students, including most of the French photographers in our exhibition upstairs. Here in the courtyard of the school, one student, the young painter Plasson, is posing for another, Louis Crête. Plasson leans against the wall to study his sort of pose, his posture, because at this point, with Le Gray's adaptation of Fenton, of Talbot's process, the exposure time is pretty long still. Le Gray wrote that depending on the amount of sunlight you had, it was 10 to 30 seconds. So this is an experiment, if you will. It's a student project to take a portrait. This is an artist study, although it's actually made by someone who was best known as a portrait photographer, Nadar, very famous portrait photographer in Paris. This study was of a well-known artist model, Marie-Christine Roux, who sat for a number of important painters, including Jean-Léon Gérôme. Now, Gérôme wrote to Nadar in 1861 asking for a copy of this photograph because he was very pressed to complete this painting in time for the 1861 Salon in Paris. And so this photograph was, a print of this photograph was supplied. Now, these pictures of nudes were subject to very different standards by the state authorities than had been addressed to painted or drawn nudes. And it was a real problem both for the photographers and for the models who risked trial and fines or even jail for posing for these photographs. And indeed, we can see that Marie-Christine Roux has actually covered her face, even though it's appropriate to Gérôme's painting. Nevertheless, this predated the painting. She's also been given a pseudonym. Mariette is the actual pseudonym from a popular story by Jules Champfleury, which featured Roux herself. So it's a nice kind of circle here. She's protected by the fictional character who was based on her herself. Well, in an artistic sense, photographic nudes looked rather raw. They seemed tremendously realistic, kind of too realistic compared to the assumption of what a nude looked like painted or drawn. And so for an audience accustomed to a more idealized representation, someone like Julien Valou de Villeneuve here has actually retouched this image quite substantially to smooth out the flesh. And he's also situated the nude within Orientalist props and drapery. So he's given her a more considered artistic context. Valou already had a successful career as a producer of erotic lithographs. So he simply when he moved into photography, he worked in much of the same kind of context. And it was a profitable context. You know, these artist studies were meant to be for artists, but artists didn't have a lot of money. Yeah, this was cheaper than hiring a model, but nevertheless, the main market for such pictures were not artists, but members of the public who wanted what were effectively censored images of nudes. And indeed, as of about 1853, more than 40% of the copyrighted photographs that were deposited at the State Dépôt Légal were figure studies. Now, they weren't allowed to be exhibited. There was an edict when you deposited your image with the Dépôt Légal. There was a note put on every image not to be exhibited. But they were nevertheless, they were there. The next largest category for the copyright register at nearly 38% were architectural and archaeological views. And these are well represented in the exhibition. Photographers are looking beyond the portrait market in the 1850s. You know, the portrait market was pretty well saturated, and very small carte visite portraits were very popular. There was no profit to be made there. So many photographers looked elsewhere. And indeed, there was a public appetite for photographs of important monuments, such as this, Saint-Denis, which was a wonderful, famous Gothic basilica where the kings and queens of France were buried. The photograph is by Edduardo Goose. We do tend to use the Baldus at the end because he was Prussian rather than French, other than Baldu. But anyway, he had moved from Prussia to Paris to work as a lithographer, and then he took up photography. He specialized in architectural views, and he had a wonderful eye. This image of a notable basilica rising up into the light, out of the dark sort of ground of an early morning view when the street is quiet, but you also get this wonderful gravity of the darkness at its base. People were fascinated by views of modern life. This is a station on the Chemin de Fer du Nord, the Northern Railway, which was the fastest railway line at the time. The trains ran at more than 30 miles an hour, which people thought was astonishing, even rather terrifying. For some rail lines, that's probably still pretty fast given what it's. And this and the Saint-Denis View were published along with 48 other Baldus photographs in an album that celebrated the train journey taken by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert to Paris on the Chemin de Fer du Nord for the Universal Exposition in 1855. Such views were often commissioned by publishers looking for saleable subject matter. Louis Blanchard Everard printed and published this for Charles Marville. It was out of Blanchard Everard's printing firm, which was set up in 1851. It's one of the two first that were set up specifically to produce photographs. Over the next 4 years, Blanchard Everard published 24 albums, amongst which were more than 100 Marville photographs from France, Germany, and Italy. Marville himself had trained as a lithographer, like Baldus, like Vallue, and they understand there's already a good market for lithographs and engravings, so they're tapping into the same market. It's an established market. They're simply adapting the product for the more modern technology. This was also a time of an expanding tourist trail. There are rail links across France to the Mediterranean, and there are steamships that go across to Greece or over to North Africa. But most people were armchair tourists, and so they bought these as collectibles, as virtual marvels, such as this one by Eugène Pillot, who was an antiquarian. He traveled to Italy and Greece to record art objects and buildings, and then he published portfolios of his photographs from both countries. The salt prints were made to look like engravings. This was deliberate in terms of the color and also the grain. These are quite grainy images. Indeed, some people criticize them for being coarse, But the Paris photography journal La Lumière described them as beautiful and large engravings in the black way with which nothing can compare. They were printed by the first photographic printing firm run by a woman, Adèle Hubert de Fontenay. Her husband had already run a successful printing company for engravings, but Fontenay's atelier specialized in photographs and was set up the same year as Blanchard Everard in 1851. She also printed for Félix Thénard's portfolio of a great big project he did along the Nile in Egypt. He was a civil engineer, and he approached this project as a photographic atlas in great detail, meticulously planned and executed. He traveled more than 1,000 miles up the Nile to complete his photographic atlas, and he produced in the end more than 160 negatives. What you see here are actually two unique objects. If you can imagine that the wax paper negative is unique, but this is a proof print. The positive is a proof print. What we see from Thénard's work are the published prints, which are trimmed and mounted onto pages for the album. This you can just about see. So you've got a black ink lines there where Thénard plans to crop his image, and there they are in white on the positive print. So this is a proof print. So it's the artist's proof. And what Thénard is doing here is photographing a temple quite high up near now. It's been moved above the Aswan Dam. It's all the way up in southern Egypt. It's an interesting image because it looks quite minimalist and pared down, and it's striking because of that. Indeed, it doesn't represent how the temple was originally. This is a temple that's been partially dismantled by local people who carted away the smaller stones for their villages nearby. So all that remains are the stones that were too big or too heavy to move. So Thénard's look at Egypt is very much about the monuments. That's a real focus for photographers. There are others who are working in the lands of the ancient world who are considering a whole range of places and artifacts. And one of them is Auguste Saltzman, who was an Alsace painter, went and learned photography from Gustave Le Gray at his school in Paris, and used photography for antiquarian travels in North Africa and Asia Minor. In Rhodes, he photographed artifacts from an excavation he undertook with the British vice consul there, Alfred Biliotti. And these are wonderful images. They're simple and striking, but they were made as records of the objects excavated. Indeed, Saltzman refused to be described as a photographer, insisting that photography was simply part of his archaeological research. And these prints, we believe, are proofs for a publication of photolithographs that was finally released just after Saltzman died, representing 60 of his negatives. It may have been published to promote sales of the artifacts, which are now held largely at the Louvre and the British Museum. Indeed, this statuette here is one of more than 4,000 objects from Biliotti and Saltzman at the British Museum. And you can just see that it's been damaged since the point when Saltzman photographed it on site in Rhodes. And so to North America. The North American uptake of Talbot's process was a bit slow because Talbot had slapped a patent on his processes, and photographers had to pay for a license. So it was cheaper to simply use the daguerreotype process, which the French state had effectively bought from Louis Daguerre and then released free to use to the whole world, with the exception of England. So if you were Scots, you could use it, but not if you were English. So yes, interesting given our present state of affairs with Brexit. Anyway, so in 1847, the patent is relinquished, and slowly, Talbot's processes are taken up. But by the time paper photography, in terms of at least the paper, salted paper prints, is active, photographers have largely moved on from paper negatives to glass plate negatives, which is the negative type that you see here for this salted paper print. And it's from very well-known work by a well-known studio. Matthew Brady's studio, you will know, as purveying photographs of the American Civil War. Indeed, Brady himself didn't take many of those pictures, particularly at this time when he was almost blind, but he had a whole range of operatives who went out into the field. And what we see largely today are albumin prints, which was a slightly later photographic process that depended on a coated paper base rather than Talbot's plain paper base. But there are very few salt prints, and so some of these are included in the exhibition. What we think in terms of them being salt prints as opposed to the more common albumin print is that these were outtakes. They were perhaps proof prints to see what was on the negative before the choice was made to publish a final image. And we know that this picture has a variant view with many of the same characters, also at the winter headquarters of the 6th Army Corps, winter of 1864, and this is the official version held at the U.S. National Archives. So we get a sense of how this was perhaps staged, and it may be that the wooden buildings were considered a better background than the tents, which might have seemed a bit provisional. But certainly this is a more informal study. The officers stand casually, they're smiling, acknowledging the camera and its operator. Now, the Civil War photographs in the early 1860s have a British precedent, which you have just seen in Roger Fenton's work in the Crimea in 1855. Indeed, as I said, Fenton's work was published in the United States. Williams in New York did publish it, and Brady's main studio was in New York. Additionally, his studio manager, Alexander Gardner, was a Scot and had been still in Britain at the time, just about at the time that Fenton's work was being seen there. So there is a precedent. Well, some of the students in this Yale University class album fought in the Civil War. This is one of them. This young man is Samuel F. Woods. The annotation, you can't really see it on this slide, but the annotation explains that he was wounded at Chancellorsville in the spring of 1863 and died back home in Massachusetts a couple months later. This young man was the son of a Mississippi plantation owner, and he and his father and brother fought with the Confederates, and they were all prisoners of war by the end of the Civil War. It's a very interesting album because there are many, many clues to life at that time of a group of young men who would become the professional class of the second half of the 19th century. And it's worth looking at the iPad presentation of the album, where you can scroll through the pages, and reading some of the anecdotes that are written on the pages, written by the compiler, the young man who compiled the album, Ahab George Wilkinson, who added anecdotes, wrote most of them in the early 1860s about many of his classmates, detailing their origins and their lives after college. They became soldiers and judges, and some had less notable histories, ending up drunk in Washington, D.C., trying to unscrew the tail off a bronze equestrian statue, broke in Paris, the pox in Italy, and at least two married money. So it's kind of a marvelous insight. There are other class albums. You know, class albums were not produced by the university, not like our class book albums today that are kind of mass produced. The students compiled them themselves. The photographer would show up in town, or if it was a big college town, you know, Boston, Cambridge, they'd have a studio, and then they'd be trying to persuade the students to sit for their photographs and persuade them to buy photographs of their classmates to put in the albums. It's interesting that a number of these class albums include photographs of people beyond the student cohort. This is a wonderful picture from a Harvard album showing a young fruit seller who worked on campus. And we've got three other such pictures in the exhibition. You know, these are photographs that the students had to buy and make the decision to purchase and put in their albums. So these are people who mattered to them, part of their experience of being students at that time. And they show us people who could never have afforded a photographic portrait of themselves. There's a wonderful representation of Niccolò. He's so little that the tripod stand kind of, you know, sticks out behind him. It's kind of holding him up so he can hold still for the exposure. But his hand holding out the apple is just shaking a little bit during the long exposure. So this is a kind of photography that's starting to get us towards where photography would go after the middle of the 19th century, towards an ultimately democratic visual world of people and places. And what we hope with this exhibition is that it does bring long ago people and far-flung places into view, that we see photography's beginnings not just as a compelling documentary and artistic medium, but as a representation of a world that's expanding. And that we also see how quickly practitioners get up to speed with an experimental technology. The materials and equipment are being updated and they're being customized. JeanBaptiste Frente, who was a painter, his own peculiar method of working with his negatives, he'd photographed on a collodion coated glass plate, and then he stripped the collodion coating off the plate and transferred it to paper or mica for printing. Now, his work was largely amateur work. His portraits are mostly of friends and family. And this is a picture of his wife and daughters and his wife's sister. Their hands form a kind of circle of affection within the composition. And at the center, Madame Frente there is looking back out at her husband behind the camera and back out to us. So these are long ago images, but they have a freshness and an immediacy, which I hope we still find compelling today. And today, when photography is mostly digital and the technology is entirely standardized and predictable, I hope we feel a kind of nostalgia for a time when the medium was newly minted, when things were surprising and amazing. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the exhibition. And I'd love to answer any questions if you've got anything you'd like to ask or say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you explain how a camera works?
How a camera works?
Yeah.
So a camera, particularly in the early years, Talbot, is a wooden box, and at the front of the box is either a tiny aperture, like a pinhole, or more commonly a lens, which will focus the light, not just make focus an image and make it more sharply resolved, but also increase the light intensity. So when the light goes through the lens and hits the inside back of the camera where your photosensitive paper or glass is, it's going to be bright enough to get a halfway decent exposure in a halfway decent period of time.
When did that process actually just disappear?
Well, salted paper prints are still made today by people who are perhaps aficionados, but also people who are working with photography as a kind of experimental artistic medium. The formulas are still available, as are really, I mean, all of these, the 19th century processes. You can not only find the original formulas, but there have been, in the last 20 years, particularly a number of books that have reprinted and updated the formulas.
Albumin became the standard, though.
That's correct. So at the time that, so for albumin comes in around 1850, and by the early 1860s, it's kind of the default printing process. And as I mentioned, albumin differs from Talbot's salted paper print process in the Talbot's process uses plain uncoated paper, and the chemicals are liquid solutions that soak in. Albumin you put a layer of egg white on the paper, and it gave you a much smoother surface, a coated surface, which increased your image resolution, and it also kept the chemicals from soaking into the paper, so the chemicals were held right up on the top surface, and it gave you a stronger, denser, and more highly resolved image. However, albumin carries within it the seeds of its own destruction, because silver compounds are very susceptible to sulfur compounds, and egg whites have sulfur compounds. So albumin prints, you have to do a post-production gold toning to try to stabilize them, as well as improve the image quality and the color.
Me or? Oh, okay. Hi. Hi. I noticed in the progression of what you were showing, it started with with the paper negatives.
Yes.
And then we saw the glass negatives, like with Thomas Ann and so on, and then it went back to paper. When was what was the paper negative preferential to the glass, and vice versa?
That's a really good question.
Not me.
Maybe me. Glass plate negatives were introduced in about 1851. They were very difficult to work with, particularly in the field. So a number of photographers remained devoted to paper negatives. Particularly somebody like Félix Thénard, who's out along the Nile and says, my method is provisional. I'm trying to make my photographs rocking on a little boat on the Nile or in a tent in the sands of the desert. So glass plate negatives were a challenge. What happened was that there then became an aesthetic distinction made between the very highly resolved, very sharp images of the glass plate negatives and the softer images produced by the paper negatives. And there were people who said, you know, what's artistic? Maybe those glass plate negatives, they're too modern, they're too sharp. What's artistic is closer to how our eyes see the world, and our eyes don't see the world completely sharp. So there was some pushback. And then in the later 19th century, when photography was really tremendously sophisticated and it bore a huge relationship to what we think of as analog photography in the 20th century even, people went back to paper negatives as an artistic choice, and they're they form part of a movement that we sometimes call pictorialism today at the turn of the century. And they have their devotees who argue fiercely for them in the photographic press.
Can you explain the difference between a paper negative and a wax paper negative, and what are the differences?
Absolutely. So when you print through a paper negative, you're going to get a lot of the artifacts of the paper fibers showing up on your print. The way you mitigate that is to wax the negative before you print it. It makes the material more translucent. It also speeds up your exposure. What Talbot tended to do was, so he'd make the ordinary paper negative and then he'd wax it before he printed it. What Gustave Le Gray figured out was that you could actually wax the negative before you sensitized it and before you exposed it, and you got a sharper, clearer image, but your exposure time got longer. So that's one of the issues with that Louis Cret portrait in Le Gray's, the courtyard of Le Gray's school, is that he's using Le Gray's wax paper negative and he's got a longer exposure time.
I've seen photographs from the 1850s, 1855, that have incredible depth of field. What's the explanation about one of Santa Barbara where something that's a block away and something that is 3 miles away are equally clear?
Yeah, so lens technology develops quite quickly. When photography is introduced, photographers are using a simple meniscus lens, a single element, and then it's understood that you can get an improved image quality by building up a compound lens using more than one lens element, and you can deal with lens aberrations more effectively. You can also get a better coverage across the whole field of view of your image. Not only will it be with better resolution across the field, but your depth of field will improve, and you'll get a brighter image right to the periphery. So compound lenses are worked on in the 1840s, particularly at the end of the 1840s, and then in the 1850s things really take off. So by 1855 you're starting to get the beginnings of what we call rectilinear lenses, and they really become established in the early 1860s, but they're certainly used in the middle of the 1850s. Okay, cheers.
I guess that's up. I just wanted to say the show is on until December 8th. Please come back as often as you wish. It's a very rich, wonderful show with Hope's texts on each and every one of the objects. And it's a real lesson in the history of photography, which I think as Hope mentioned, is, I think, ever more important to us today living in our media-saturated culture. So thank you so much again for coming, and please go upstairs and enjoy the exhibition.
Thank you.